The colonnade is longer than you remember. You are in Rome, late August, midday. The kind of heat that turns the piazza into a pan and makes the stone walls radiate something back at you that is not quite light. You walk the full length of Borgo Santo Spirito, past the tourist restaurants and the souvenir shops with their wall of postcards, past the groups of pilgrims moving at the pace of people who have somewhere to be, their matching lanyards catching the sun. And now you are standing here. The perimeter wall of Vatican City. You have read about what is behind it, you have watched the documentaries, you have spent time on forums where people share what they believe is in there and argue with each other about the fragments of evidence they have assembled. 85 kilometers of shelving, they say. 85. Longer than a marathon. Longer than most people can walk in a single day. You know, or you think you know. What is somewhere in that distance? Level 3, the restricted section. The vault with a physical lock that requires more than a researcher's credential. The scrolls that popes have read in private and never discussed outside that room. The documents that would prove the Gospels were constructed, not revealed. That would end the argument. That explains why the institution has always seemed to know something you were not supposed to know. You are standing in the afternoon heat with your hand on the stone, and you can feel the specific weight of that gap. The difference between what you were told is there and what you cannot verify. You are right that something is there. You are just looking at the wrong building. My name is Nathan, former high school history teacher, Evansville, Indiana. 12 years at a Catholic school teaching world history and early Christianity. I resigned when the evidence kept leading me somewhere the institution was not prepared to follow. I want to start where you probably started, typing Vatican Secret Archive Level 3 into a search engine, because I did the same thing. Not once, repeatedly. Over the course of about 2 weeks with an increasingly specific set of search terms, convinced that I was narrowing in on something. Here is what I found. There is no Level 3. The Vatican Secret Archives, officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive in 2019, has no such designation. No Level 1, no Level 2, no Level 3. The archive is organized by pontificate and institutional body. You search by era, by office, by the name of the Pope, whose administration generated the documents you need. You do not search by security clearance level, because security clearance levels are not how the archive is structured. That is the first layer of what I found. The second layer is the 2019 renaming itself. When the Vatican announced they were dropping the word secret, they explained it in a press statement. The explanation is in the original Latin name, Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the word secretum. In classical and ecclesiastical Latin, in the context of Vatican administration, secretum did not mean classified. It did not mean forbidden. It did not mean hidden from scrutiny pending the decision of an authority who would determine what you were permitted to know. It meant private property of the Pope, his personal administrative records, his correspondence, his contracts, his institutional documentation, the filing cabinet of the papal office, not forbidden knowledge, the Pope's files. For 400 years the label did the work. Secret. The word carries a specific gravity in any language. Nobody read the footnote. The footnote was in Latin anyway. So the mythology of Level 3 was built at its foundation on a mistranslation of one Latin word that was amplified across 4 centuries by people who never looked at the original name long enough to ask what it meant. That is the first layer of this investigation, a name that sounded like something it was not, and an institution that never corrected the misreading because the misreading was, in its own way, useful. Now let me tell you about the parts that are actually restricted, because there are restricted sections. They are just not where you think they are. The Archivum Arcis, documents from the former Castel Sant'Angelo, the papal fortress across the Tiber that served as the refuge of popes under siege for centuries. Those papers include records of the Roman Inquisition, trials, confessions, condemnations, the institutional documentation of the Church's formal apparatus for identifying and prosecuting heresy. These have been accessible to accredited scholars since 1966. The Archivio della Penitenziaria Apostolica, confessional records going back to 1310, has been open to qualified researchers under controlled conditions for decades. And then there are the Pius XII archives. Pope Pius XII, governed the Catholic Church from 1939 to 1958. He governed through the Second World War, through the Nazi occupation of Rome, through the Holocaust. His personal papers, his correspondence, his administrative records were sealed after his death. For 62 years, they were opened in March 2020. When I first encountered that number, 62 years, I wrote it down and sat with it for a while. Not because the length surprised me, because of what the restriction timeline, read carefully, actually says. The Inquisition records, centuries of trials, confessions, and executions in the name of doctrinal purity, were opened to scholars in 1966, old enough to be history, old enough for the institution to present it as something that happened to a different church. The Holocaust period papers, what the Pope knew and when he knew it, what he chose to do and what he chose not to do during the systematic murder of 6 million people in the same decades he governed from Rome, those were sealed for 62 years and opened in 2020. I am not here to adjudicate what Pius XII did. Historians who have spent careers on that question are still arguing, and they have had access to the papers for 5 years. What I am pointing at is simpler than that. The restriction itself is information. The 62 years is a statement. What an institution chooses to hold and for how long tells you something about what it calculates it has to lose. The Inquisition was old enough to survive daylight. The wartime papacy, apparently, required 62 more years of consideration. You always knew the version you were given was edited, not in a conspiratorial sense, not with a theory attached to it, just the texture. Edited things have a specific texture, a smoothness where roughness should be, a completeness that feels slightly too complete, the absence of the contradictions and loose ends that real things always carry. You could not have named it at 12, or at 20, or at 40, but you felt it the way you feel when a story resolves too cleanly, when every question the account raises is answered before you finish asking it, when nothing in the narrative surprises the narrative itself. The instinct that brought you to the Vatican archive, the conviction that something is being held back, is the correct instinct. You were just given the wrong map. The mystery is not behind a locked door in a numbered level. The mystery has a catalog number, and it has been in the public catalog of the Vatican Library for 600 years. Let me tell you about the trip. I flew to Rome specifically to request access to archive materials for a project on the canonical decisions of the 4th century. This is not as dramatic as it sounds. The archive has a formal application process. You submit a letter from an academic institution, a research purpose statement, a formal request listing the specific materials and date ranges you intend to examine. I had all of that. I submitted the documentation. I was processed correctly, the way any credentialed researcher is processed. I received access to the section I had requested. I spent 2 days inside. I was working through correspondence related to the Council of Laodicea and the canonical decisions of the 360s, the era when the institutional church was drawing the lines between what would be scripture and what would not. I found useful material. I made notes. I did not find what I actually went to Rome to find, because what I actually went to Rome to find was not in the archive. On the second afternoon, I was packing up my materials to leave. One of the senior archivists walked by, a woman who had been working in that building for 30 years, who had the specific quality of patience that develops in people who spend decades watching researchers search for the wrong thing. She glanced at what I had been reading. She said, "If you are interested in early gospel manuscripts, the library has a digitized manuscript you should look at, vat.gr.1209. It is in the open catalog, not the archive. The library. 2 separate buildings, 2 separate institutions, 2 separate catalog systems. I had flown to Rome. I had submitted documentation. I had been inside the Vatican archive, and the most significant document in the history of New Testament textual scholarship was in the library catalog. The open section, available to anyone with an internet connection and the patience to find the digitized version. I sat in the exit hall and looked at my notes for about 10 minutes. Not because I was disappointed, because of what that moment clarified. Everyone who spends years searching for what the Vatican is hiding, and the Vatican's most explosive textual document is filed under library, catalog number vat.gr vat.1209. That is where this investigation actually begins. vat.gr.1209. That designation means Vatican, Greek manuscript number 1209. The full name is Codex Vaticanus. What it is: the oldest near-complete New Testament manuscript in existence, dated to approximately 300 to 325 of the Common Era, which makes it roughly 1,700 years old. The Vatican has possessed it since at least 1475. It appears in their catalogue from that year, 600 years of documented custody. Now, a 1,700-year-old manuscript is significant for any number of reasons. But Codex Vaticanus is not remarkable primarily because of its age. It is remarkable because of what it does not contain. The Gospel of Mark in Codex Vaticanus ends at chapter 16, verse 8. Let me tell you what verse 8 says. The women have come to the tomb at dawn. The stone has been rolled away. A young man in white is sitting inside. He tells them, Jesus has risen. He is not here. Go tell the disciples. He has gone to Galilee ahead of you. And then, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. That is verse 8. That is where the Gospel of Mark ends in the oldest manuscript the Vatican owns. After verse 8, there is a blank column. In a manuscript culture where parchment was more expensive than labor, where scribes calculated every inch of material, where leaving space empty was a measurable financial decision, the blank column is a statement. Either the scribes knew the ending had been lost and were leaving space for it if someone found it, or the scribes knew there was no continuation, that this was where the account stopped, and they honored that stop with deliberate space. What is not in Codex Vaticanus, what was never there, is Mark chapter 16 verses 9 through 20, 12 verses. The risen Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene, his appearance to 2 disciples on the road, his appearance to the 11 as they ate, the Great Commission, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. The signs that will accompany those who believe: they will drive out demons, they will speak in new tongues, they will pick up snakes with their hands. The ascension: he was taken up into heaven and sat at the right hand of God. The disciples going out and preaching everywhere, the Lord confirming their message. Those 12 verses appear in virtually every Bible printed since Gutenberg. They are the foundation of Easter Sunday sermons in every denomination that observes Easter. The Great Commission, verse 15, is the scriptural basis of every global Christian missionary effort from the age of exploration to the present day. Verse 18, they will pick up snakes, is the textual foundation of every snake-handling church in Appalachia. None of those 12 verses are in Codex Vaticanus. The Vatican has known this since the 14th century. They have had this manuscript in their catalogue since 1475. Now, Codex Vaticanus is not the only witness. Codex Sinaiticus is a 4th century Greek manuscript of roughly the same period. It is held by the British Library. It also ends Mark at chapter 16, verse 8, 2 of the oldest surviving manuscripts of the New Testament from independent textual traditions, produced in different places by different hands, both ending the Gospel of Mark at the same verse. That is not a scribal error. That is a textual consensus, and there is testimony from within the tradition itself. Eusebius of Caesarea, writing around 313 of the Common Era in the Historia Ecclesiastica, is the official historian of the newly legitimized church. He was working under the patronage of Constantine. He had access to the imperial archives. He addressed the question of Mark's ending directly. He recorded that in nearly all Greek manuscripts he examined, Mark ended at chapter 16, verse 8. Not some manuscripts, nearly all. Eusebius was not troubled. He reported this the way an archivist reports a finding. The manuscript tradition he surveyed ended at verse 8. That was the norm of his era. Then Jerome, the 4th century scholar who produced the Latin Vulgate, the Bible translation that became the standard of the Western Church for more than 1,000 years, confirmed in his letter Ad Hidibium around 407 of the Common Era that almost all Greek copies he examined ended at chapter 16, verse 8. Both Eusebius in 313 and Jerome in 407 were saying the same thing. This ending was not the result of a scribal accident. This was what the manuscript said, across the entire textual tradition they had access to. Then Bruce Metzger, Princeton University, foremost Protestant textual scholar of the 20th century. His textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, published by the United Bible Societies in 1994, is the standard academic reference in this field. Metzger was a devout Christian. He was not hostile to the tradition he was analyzing. He documented that the longer ending of Mark, the 12 verses, is not found in the oldest and most reliable manuscripts, and shows signs of being a later compilation, assembled from material in the other Gospels, rather than composed by Mark. Not lost, assembled by someone other than Mark. And Bart Ehrman, professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In Misquoting Jesus, published by Harper I in 2005, he writes, "The most important verse in the history of snake-handling churches, Mark chapter 16, verse 18, 'They will pick up snakes with their hands,' comes from a passage that almost certainly was not written by Mark. Not written by Mark, added. At some point after the oldest manuscripts were produced, by someone who looked at chapter 16, verse 8, trembling women who fled and said nothing to anyone, and concluded that a gospel could not end there. Someone decided the ending needed managing. Someone assembled 12 verses from the other Gospels, attached them to the end of Mark, and those 12 verses became the resurrection account that has been read aloud on Easter Sunday for 17 centuries. Open the Vatican Library website. The digitized catalog is public. Anyone with an internet connection can find vat.gr.1209. You can zoom to the individual letters formed in the ink. You can follow the text column by column, find the Gospel of Mark. Work through it the way you work through anything you expect to resolve. You reach chapter 16, verse 8. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. You keep scrolling, the way your thumb moves when you expect content to continue. There is nothing. Just the column. Just the space the scribes left on expensive parchment in a manuscript they worked for years to produce. You wait for the next line, the one you know, the one you have heard at Easter. He has risen. Go into all the world, the Great Commission. The text does not continue. The blank column is not dramatic. That is what stays with you. It is just space. Careful, deliberate, expensive. Left by scribes in the 4th century who either knew the ending had been lost or knew there was no ending to find. It has been there. In the Vatican Library catalog, since at least 1475. This is where J.J. Benítez enters this investigation in a way I did not expect. Benítez spent 40 years working through the historical record of Jesus and the people around him. In Caballo de Troya, 10 volumes built on meticulous reconstruction of the 1st century world, his narrators claim to have observed those events directly. The resurrection sequence for Benítez is not a doctrinal abstraction. His narrators describe what they say they witnessed, and what they describe does not match Mark chapter 16 verses 9 through 20, not in all the specific choreography, not in the precise sequence of appearances, not in certain details of the encounters that the longer ending specifies. Now, I want to be precise about how I hold his work. Benítez's methodology in Caballo de Troya operates outside the verification standards that Ehrman or Metzger would apply. I am always clear about that distinction. His narrator's claims to direct observation cannot be subjected to the kind of analysis I apply to Codex Vaticanus or the testimony of Eusebius. But here is what I found valuable about his specific observation on this point. He did not treat the divergence between his narrator's account and Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, as a problem for his narrative. He treated it as confirmation. He writes, and I am working from my notes here, not a direct quote from memory, that the original was more disturbing, not less, that what was added to Mark was a management of the ending, not an invention of the resurrection itself, but a direction. Someone decided how the story should close. Someone decided that trembling women who said nothing to anyone was not the right final image for the gospel of the Son of God. Someone decided how the story should close. That phrase, I kept returning to it, because if Codex Vaticanus is right, And Eusebius and Jerome and Metzger and Ehrman all point in the same direction. Then at some point in the first few centuries of Christian history, someone looked at the Gospel of Mark ending at chapter 16 verse 8 and made a decision. That is not where this ends, so they wrote 12 more verses, or assembled them, attached them to the end of Mark, and for 17 centuries, those 12 verses have been read aloud on Easter Sunday. In every denomination that reads Scripture aloud, in every language into which Christianity was translated, on every continent where the Church sent missionaries carrying the Great Commission that those 12 verses authorize. And the manuscript the Vatican has possessed for 600 years does not contain them. I want to be precise about what I am and am not saying. I am not saying the resurrection did not happen. That is a theological question. This is a textual one. The textual question is this: did Mark, the author of the oldest gospel, write those 12 verses? And the answer that the oldest surviving manuscripts give, the answer that Eusebius gave in 313, the answer that Jerome gave in 407, the answer that Metzger gave in 1994, the answer that Ehrman gave in 2005 is almost certainly not. The Church has known this for 600 years. Not as a secret, not as a classified finding in a restricted level, as a catalogued manuscript, vat.gr.1209, accessible to scholars, documented in their own library, available to anyone who looks for it. Think about that for a second. The documents that the mythology tells you are hidden in level 3, locked in a vault, protecting the institution from collapse, read only by popes in private and never discussed. The most significant of those documents has a catalogue number. It is not in the vault, it is in the library. It has been there since 1475. And this is where I want to slow down, because I think the institutional strategy here is more sophisticated than a conspiracy and more permanent. The Vatican did not hide Codex Vaticanus. They could not have hidden it. It was known to scholars from the beginning. Eusebius described what the manuscript said in 313. Jerome confirmed it in 407. The manuscript was in the catalogue by 1475. What happened instead is something quieter. The conversation was moved. The mythology of level 3, the forbidden vault, the restricted level, absorbed the energy of everyone who suspected something was being concealed. The documentary makers pointed their cameras at the archive building. The researchers submitted their applications, gained access, and looked in the places where institutional secrets are supposed to be. Nobody pointed the camera at the library. And in the library there is a digitized manuscript you can read right now, on your phone, in the parking lot of the church you stopped attending 3 years ago, on a Tuesday at 11 at night when you cannot sleep, and the question that has been sitting in the back of your mind finally surfaces with enough urgency to do something about it. It ends Mark at verse 8. The blank column is right there. The suppression mechanism is not secrecy. It is misdirection. 4 centuries of a Latin word doing the work of a classified stamp. 4 centuries of anyone who searched for forbidden knowledge being pointed toward the archive while the library catalogue sat open. You are still outside the wall. The heat has not changed. The colonnade shadow is a little longer now. The afternoon is moving toward the point where the stone cools slightly, and the tourists begin moving toward dinner. You have been standing here trying to figure out what is on the other side. And now you know something that nobody inside that wall is required to announce. The scroll that contradicts the gospel is not in level 3. It is vat.gr.1209. It has a catalogue number. It is in the Vatican Library, not the archive. The library, not the restricted section. The public catalogue, available for 600 years. The blank column in Mark chapter 16, verse 8. The space after the women fled. The deliberate empty parchment that cost the scribes the same hours and the same money as the parchment they covered with text. They left it empty, because they knew what you are only now finding out. The ending that changed everything, the risen Jesus, the Great Commission, the ascension, was not in the gospel they were copying, and the building that contains the manuscript that proves it is 20 minutes from where you are standing. Not behind a restricted door, not at the end of 85 kilometers of shelving, not in a vault that requires a clearance level nobody will officially confirm exists, in a catalogue, with a number, vat.gr.1209. You can look it up. This is Nathan. Forbidden Gospels.